Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Public Funds Public Schools webinar, and we have a very exciting event today. My name is Jessica Levin. I'm an attorney at Education Law Center, and I direct the Public Funds Public Schools campaign, which is a national campaign led by ELC to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools, not diverted to private school vouchers and similar schemes. Today, we will hear from Education Law Center's very own visiting senior fellow, Professor Josh Cowen, about his new book, The Privateers. Josh has been traveling around the country to talk about his new book, and we're thrilled that he's here today to chat with us. There will also be plenty of time for audience Q&A. Make sure to drop your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and you can do that throughout, and then we will get to them during the Q&A portion. Josh will be in conversation today with Maria Bautista, who is the lead trainer at NYU Metro Center's Education Justice Research and Organizing Collaborative, where she is supporting national education justice campaigns. Maria has previously worked at the Alliance for Quality Education and has over 15 years experience in organizing. Maria, we are thrilled to have you here as well, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi, y'all. I'm Maria, she, her pronouns with the NYU Metro Center, as Jessica said. And I love that campaign, Jessica, Public Funds for Public Schools. I'll share a little bit about my personal experience and like why I'm so excited to be here. I actually went to parochial schools all my life, K through 12. And in some ways, this sense of these attacks, these culture wars, I felt it very palpably. K through 12. I was never reflected in schools. I never really learned about the real history of my own personal background and the context within the United States. And then I went to the City College of New York, a public university, and it was so radical, so different. And it was education for liberation, like just everything that a young person would want, like to see themselves deeply and truly reflected, to hear real history and like it changed my perception of like my context here. And it's also where I started to do community organizing and pushing back against military on campus and the cuts to public schools, specifically tuition hikes at CUNY in New York. And I really made a commitment to organizing. I felt like the deepest parts of that was about building people power. And through people power, we can win. And specifically around education, like this idea, like having a radical foundation changed my life, my ability to walk in this world and how I see myself. And I made a commitment specifically to education organizing, and I've been doing that for over 15 years now, originally in New York State and now across the nation. And one of the first things that I ever organized around was a charter school co-location. And Josh talks about this a lot, schemes and scams. And that's how I felt. I was like, what's the scheme? I haven't seen it quite before, but I understood right away what it meant for Black and Brown communities. So, and as I've been doing this national work, really digging into like the role of vouchers. And I'm really geeked out to be here with you, Josh, to talk
Thank
about
you.
your work. And part of community organizing is this being able to do political education. And in some ways, I feel like this is what this is. So y'all, Josh is the author of Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. And I know you're a policy analyst, you're a researcher, you're an advocate, you dislike vouchers. But in order to open up this conversation, I want to hear a little bit about you, Josh, and I also would love for you to share with folks here who you are and what
Yeah,
brings
thanks
you.
for, well, thank you for that, Maria. Thanks to my colleagues at the moment at ELC and PFPS, and thanks to all of you for being here today on a Thursday afternoon. Yeah, as you said, Maria, I am a policy analyst by training. So what's that mean? What it means is that for the last 20 plus years, since early days of graduate school for me, I'm a professor, so we always talk about graduate school and our origin story. I was always interested in asking questions about like what publicly funded programs work and how do they work, on what basis, and for whom do they work, and for whom do they not work, and what is the why behind those questions, the answers to those questions. And I've always been drawn to research questions around hot topics, like topics that maybe have a lot of heat around them, and hope that my research can help bring a little light to, in addition to that heat, as the saying goes. And actually, as a young sort of person in the profession, first started this work in data crunching and data collection in big voucher studies of voucher programs. I write about this in the book. And those studies were led by folks who, with a known take, a reputation for being fairly favorable to vouchers, but at that time, still we were in this political conversation, from the earliest career folks to the most senior folks, that it was still okay to kind of have difference in debate around data and around evidence. Um, and so I sort of, was always intrigued by that, and then moved forward into my career working also on vouchers, charter schools, but also stuff that had nothing to do with school choice. Um, and really came up through something called the evidence-based movement in education, which simply came out of the George W. Bush years. This idea that we had a lot of skill sets across a variety of different social science techniques, data, statistics, things like this, that we could start to ask really hard questions about some of these things that for historically had not had a lot of evidence one way or the other behind them, just a lot of ideology. I was always drawn to that kind of stuff. Um, Over the last decade, sort of from now until, say, looking back 10, 12 years, voucher programs. So by vouchers, we mean for today, does something pay for private K-12 tuition with public taxpayer dollars? And do you have to leave public schools to get those dollars? If it meets those two criterion, that's a voucher. Over the last decade, as vouchers have grown in size and scope, and more kids have used vouchers, we've seen, according to any of the benchmarks that I just mentioned in social science, some of the worst results in the history of the education research profession. And so for me, coming into this question, the question the book sets out to answer is, why is it that, if in a world where policy and education is at least supposedly supposed to be at least partly informed by data and evidence, why are we having these voucher schemes passing at a historic rate when the historic evidence behind them is catastrophic? And the answer the book settles on is really, we are in this kind of Christian nationalist moment in this country, this culture war moment in this country. The Donald Trump presidency in particular called us back to a darker time, an origin story for vouchers, that motivates these things today in a way that 20 years ago wasn't necessarily the case, at least on the surface. So that's kind of where I am and how I got here today.
Thank you, Josh. You dropped a lot there, and I'm trying to think about like where to go. I had these questions laid out, but I actually originally, and we can jump into this later. I was going to ask what is the role of the culture wars, but actually, you talk about this darker time that actually history repeats itself.
Mhm.
And you just mentioned that I actually would love for you to talk about the role of vouchers in this country, and not just now, like what has that looked like in the past and what
Yes.
relevance have to what we're seeing.
So let's focus this, because I did dump a lot in there. Let's focus this kind of culture war thing on one very specific topic, and that's this phrase education freedom and this phrase parents' rights, the idea of values that links those two phrases together. So in 1955, this conservative economist named Milton Friedman, sort of the godfather of the voucher movement, wrote an essay in which he proposed school vouchers. In this essay, 1955, what else was going on then? Well, it was the year that Rosa Parks started the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. It's also just a few months, Friedman's essay was published just a few months after Brown versus Board of Education. And what segregationists resisting Brown immediately latched onto in Friedman's essay and pamphlet was the idea that maybe, we could take government dollars, we could take public funds and turn them into private scholarships, as they called them, in a way that would allow for segregation to continue and to continue on the public dime ultimately, but not in a way that violated the Supreme Court's ruling. And they needed to, as I mentioned in the book, a lot of this legislation was very overt that parents to use these voucher systems could do and would even have to be eligible to do so, would have to say they were doing so specifically to avoid racial integration. In sample legislation in Texas that I cite in the book, parents would have had to sign an affidavit actually that actually said, well, we're asking for this voucher to avoid racial integration because our values do not align with racial integration. And so when I say that today this vouchers call back to that earlier darker period of time, that's what I'm talking about. Because if you listen to a lot of the kind of the right-wing organizers in this space sort of beating up on public schools in particular, a lot of their cultural warfare that they're waging against private schools comes down to this word values and the idea that somehow public schools are somehow indoctrinating kids with values simply because kids exist in those classrooms, and the idea that some children might have to go to school next to one another is somehow contrary to one parent's values, the existence of another child in a public classroom. So there's a lot sort of that goes on in this space, but that is the area of the culture war in particular that we're talking about today. And everything that we talk about today, whether it's where people go to the bathroom or what type of racial history is taught in public school, who plays which sports, which books are there and which are banned, all kind of come down to this conflict over this idea that the mere existence of of different people, different traditions, different religious histories, and different backgrounds is somehow offensive to some parents, and they should have the right on the public dime to isolate and separate themselves from those people in the name of values.
Mm, yeah, and that feels very palpable in my work. I know the value is, you know, it is coded. It's very coded, and I think what we want to lift up here is that it's coded and it's coded on purpose, because what they're doing is so sinister. So like dog whistle, I think a lot about dog whistle politics right now. And I know that we've been talking about like how this has looked like in the past, but I'd love for you to share a little bit more around what's the role of the culture wars in the current education landscape? How does that shape us?
Well, it's a good question. So let's take Project 2025. Let's be concrete. Project 2025, this kind of Uber document put forward by the right-wing Heritage Foundation, blueprint for a Trump presidency. It's kind of the Cliff Notes version is Trump's own platform. Well, there's a lot of culture war language in the education space in these documents. So, as an example, two of the three first paragraphs in the education chapter to Project 2025. Two of those first three paragraphs. First paragraph is let's get rid of the U.S. Department of Education, which is the chief anti-discrimination authority in the United States when it comes to schools and colleges. So number one, let's get rid of that thing. And number two, vouchers. And number three, vouchers again. Two of those first three paragraphs are vouchers. First, getting rid of this anti-discrimination authority. The rest of these, the education section and substantial pieces of the forward are all kinds of kind of conservative buzzwords out there. Woke ideology, gender ideology, this kind of strange fixation they have on this term critical race theory, this strange fixation they have on DEI, as they call it, diversity, equity, inclusion programs in public schools and colleges. Really kind of sort of weirdly obsessive stuff on this issue, on these issues, not things that like are about kids learning or about how to make sure that kids aren't hungry in schools or how kids are safe in schools. It's just this kind of culture war stuff. And that is really what passes for conservative education public policy today is organized around those things. It is in the blueprint of the Trump platform and the Heritage Foundation's document. So that's what shapes these things on the right now. And vouchers are the key policy vehicle for doing that, because at the end of the day, again, kind of what links all of those things to vouchers is the idea that we're going to use these public dollars to carve out different groups of people, separate, isolate them into different groups, different schools, different, in many cases, just different religious traditions in these schools, but not exclusively so. And that's sort of the unifying idea here, that folks shouldn't have to interact, shouldn't have to get along. Community doesn't exist. And instead, what we've have are these sort of little balkanized groups that that all take public dollars, and that's the only thing they have in common.
Yeah, I appreciate that breakdown. I think as an organizer, I've been thinking a lot about like the national landscape and the role that this strategy plays, specifically to divide and conquer our communities. Like everyone benefits from public education. And the DEI and the Stop Woke and the CRT, what it creates is that division and what they're able to do because of it, right? Like that they're able to consolidate their riches because of it and take from our public schools because we're fighting each other. Um, and actually, I want to get into this topic of vouchers because I think it sounds so sexy. You know, we had this, they tried it in New York, they called it a tax credit, and it was really palpable. And at one point it was going to pass. But I want you to just talk to us about why are vouchers so scary in this moment? What's
Well,
that?
so you used the word sexy. One word that I often use is it's um, it's easier in some sense. So it's what vouchers do is they allow uh, in some sense, force people not to ask hard questions or to confront hard reality. So with vouchers, at least the argument the other side makes on this is we don't have to talk about racism in this country. We don't have to talk about income inequality in this country. We don't have to talk about lack of geographic access to high quality schools in this country. We just have to give everyone a coupon and they'll go find their own way in life. I mean, in some sense, vouchers in that way mirror most other conservative public policy interventions. Just give everybody a coupon and let the market decide. What's dangerous here, though, about that is first of all, they don't work. And I do want to make sure we can get to that and talk about it. They don't work. I call vouchers the education equivalent of predatory lending. The results are horrific for particularly for at-risk kids. But setting even that piece aside, what's dangerous is that first of all, these pose massive funding threats to public schools. And public schools, we know, still educate by far the most kids in this country. So these are substantial threats to public schools, including in your own community. Um, but they also do. Uh, I think there's something a little bit more fundamental than even dollars and cents and even academic outcomes, both of which are threatened by these voucher schemes. And that does go back to this idea that if we are going to, I call vouchers the new religious separatism in this country. If we are going to make public policy at this point by simply devoting more and more resources to groups to go isolate, separate from each other, different kids learning, not learning, or learning, depending on your perspective, how to grow up around folks who don't live like themselves, don't love like themselves, don't have the same family structures as themselves, don't necessarily even speak the same language as themselves. If the idea here is we're only going to uh, uh, interact with and make decisions with and come up with common goals around people who do look, think, act, love, believe like we do, I think we've got serious problems for how to move forward into anything resembling a safe and healthy place for the next generation in this country. And so that is actually something incredibly threatening, just from the standpoint of what kind of world do we want to live in? One that separates, isolates, and divides us, or one that brings us together and asks us to solve common problems. I think it's really that fundamental a question here.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I feel like naming that allows us to really address the strategy underneath it all, which is dividing people. And like on the organizer's job is figuring out what are those things that unite us so that we can create those bridges and fight together. And we need that more than ever, not just on vouchers, but across the board, to defend public education. I do want you to go in on why they don't work. And share a little bit about what you found, what research there is around that.
Well, let me tell you. So what's really important, and folks, if you're on this call and paid attention to anything I've said and written over the last few years, it's what we know is a few things really right off the bat. First of all, uh, voucher 70% of or so roughly 70% of voucher users were already in private school to begin with, or were never at least never in public school. So a lot of the marketing around these schemes is they have come up with all these brand tested names: opportunity scholarships, hope scholarships, freedom scholarships, nonsense like this. At the end of the day, most voucher users are already in private school. Okay. For the 25 to 30% of voucher users who do switch, at least have historically, and they do exist, they are often leaving public schools that have struggled to meet expectations. They often because they've been under-resourced public schools to begin with, but they are leaving many of those schools. But the schools they're going into, partly as a consequence of the fact that most voucher users are already in private school to begin with, the schools that are taking these kids are what I call subprime providers. They're not any good. These are schools that have space open for a reason. Usually, they're financially distressed, often attached to church basements or other type of religious organizations that really partly self-fund through voucher systems or through revenue in public or privately gained revenue as a result of tuition. So not organizations that necessarily have the academic interests of those children at heart. And yet, because of the amount of marketing that goes into these schemes, pulling parents away from public schools that, again, in some cases have not necessarily lived up to the promise those parents want. This is why I call these voucher schemes education's predatory lending. They go into these communities, often communities of at-risk kids, and say, you have been failed, and a coupon will solve your problem. Just come to a private school. And because of what this kind of notion of private schools in general is some type of elite education. There are many elite private providers, but they are not the ones that take vouchers for the most part. Uh, you see kids switching from public to private school, and their results have tended to be dreadful, at least over the last decade. The bigger and the more recent the voucher scheme, the worse the results have been for kids. You have to go, and we're not just talking about, well, oh, test scores don't measure everything, which is true, but they are the metric that public schools are that critics and supporters alike have used on public schools to gauge value on that same metric when we've been able to have apples to apples comparisons. The test score results for voucher users, kids who transfer from public to private school, are some of the worst we've ever seen on any research question. You do have to go to something like what Hurricane Katrina did to test scores of kids in New Orleans after the hurricane, the disruption there. You have to go to something like what COVID-19 did more recently to get at the magnitude of the learning loss associated with voucher use. So whatever else vouchers do or don't do, they are not a solution to academic inequality in this country.
Yeah, so it's a scheme. Rich people are profiting in all kinds of ways. And also it's horribly failing our kids. And you talked about this a little, Josh, but I'd love if you could just expand on the role that underfunding of our public school system plays in all of this.
The most pernicious myth in American public policy when it comes to education over the last 3 to 4 decades has been the myth that investing in public schools doesn't work. And this has been a talking point on the right for as long as I've been probably alive, certainly as long as I've been a professional in this space, except that it isn't true. So over the last decade, again, as the evidence against vouchers has accumulated and the research and the data quality have gotten better on both vouchers or anything else in education, one of the things we've been able to find out conclusively, to the point where experts in the school finance community have said the debate is essentially settled, to quote one extraordinarily well-known expert. The debate on this is settled. More money helps public schools. Less money hurts public schools. Study after study after study after study after study shows this, and not just on test scores, although it is true on test scores, but things like later in life wages, reductions in the probability that kids will have contact with the criminal justice system, even life expectancy. All of those sort of downstream outcomes have been shown to have marked, meaningful improvements in school districts that have had deep investments in them earlier. And conversely, we know from data collected during the Great Recession that slowdowns or cuts to public school spending have adversely affected children. The thing that vouchers do is they take money out of these public school communities, usually at the state level. I can get into the nuts and bolts on how this happens if we need to, but for the moment, just understand that what vouchers there's no such thing as a free a blank check. Okay, like the money's got to come from somewhere, whether it comes directly out of what the dedicated line item for school for public schools, or it comes from some other place in the state budget. It slows down public school spending when you spend money on two education sectors. And so that is really one of the big overall threats, is that it takes dollars out of something we know generally works. The more money invested in public schools, the better the outcomes, and gives it to something we know that doesn't work, especially for at-risk kids and families, and that's voucher schemes.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. And I don't know if you want to share like the landscape right now around how much money we're talking about. How much money are we taking from public schools, public dollars for this scheme?
Yeah, there's different estimates. So just a couple weeks ago, researchers at Georgetown University estimated that just on universal vouchers, which are vouchers for 11 states have programs that no matter what your income, you can get a voucher to help your private school costs. Something like $4 billion, and I think that's probably a low ball, but something like $4 billion are being spent today on tuition. Again, most of that is for kids who are already in private school, those universal schemes. So about 70% back of the envelope of that 4 billion going to kids already in private school were paying before taxpayers picked up the check. But let's use another number. So Betsy DeVos, sort of the billionaire heiress, lives not that far away from me here in Michigan, probably the chief architect of vouchers over the last 10 to 15 years. Her organization, and CNN reported in May that Betsy DeVos's organization, a 501c4 group called the American Federation for Children, has spent more than $250 million over the last decade. And that number is now a little out of date, over $250 million over the last decade to get back 25 billion with a B dollars in taxpayer funding for private schools over that same period in time. That means that for every $1 Betsy DeVos and allies have put into lobbying for voucher schemes, they've gotten back $100 in public funding for these voucher schemes. So somewhere, I mean, it depends on how you estimate it, but at the end of the day, we are talking about billions and billions in price tag here at this point. Again, primarily benefiting children who are already in private school.
Yeah, and they're building their wealth, they're extracting wealth from the backs of Black, brown, poor children across the country, and it's wrong. And you mentioned the American Federation for Children. They always have these like really amazing names, but whenever you hear that, you know what's up, these kinds of names. And I want to just come back to Betsy DeVos because, at the heart of all of this, Betsy DeVos advocates very strongly for a Christian ethno-state. And there is a specific role that religion plays in all of this. And I'd love for you to jump into that and talk about that a bit.
All of these organizations, with the exception of a handful of kind of very libertarian types associated with the Koch brothers and the oil and gas industry, all of them have some far right religious bent at this point. And I mean, listen, Betsy DeVos has said in public comments that the whole point of school vouchers is to, quote, advance God's kingdom. Those are her words, not mine. Uh, she has lamented also in public commentary, her words, not mine. She has lamented what she sees as the replacement of churches as centers of community by public schools as centers of community. She sees vouchers as a way to replace public schools as centers of community, bring back churches, as if churches aren't centers of community already. So this is very clear. There's a group called the Herzog Foundation, a big right-wing funder that sort of takes a big player in the middle of this country, out of Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, those type of places. And they have said school vouchers are our mission field. The whole point is to bring back fill congregations, expand congregations, with school choice leading the way as the policy designed to do this. So, if you're and listen, I am someone whose faith tradition is I was raised Catholic. I write about this in the book. I sing in a church choir. I am not here to beat up on religious faith, but the idea that that taxpayer dollars should go to literally proselytizing, to literally going out and to convert children, to convert parents of children, and that's what school vouchers are doing these days. I think is not only wrong, but is really kind of a fundamental threat to some pretty basic ideas that we have in this country about kind of who's it for and kind of what our deep, longstanding tradition of separation between church and state really has been and must be.
Yeah, I really appreciate you talking a little bit about that. And I shared also that I went to parochial schools, to Catholic schools, and know that a lot of these schools get to decide what the curriculum is. And I know that we started talking about the culture wars.
Yeah.
If you could just talk a little bit about like what's the curriculum like in some of these schools?
Well, not only get to decide the curriculum, but get to decide who they admit, right? And that's one of the other big myths here is that when it comes to vouchers, it's not school choice. It's the school's choice. The schools do the admitting, the schools do the picking. So it's again something to really keep in mind. Listen, there are such thing as rigorous elite private schools out there. I went to one for 3 years without a voucher. At sometimes my right-wing critics like to jump on that fact, but here's the thing: in that I have in common with the 70% of voucher users who were in private school before vouchers picked up the tab. Vouchers would have helped me or my family. They would not have helped kids in struggling public schools in my neighborhood, and that's just the reality of the data. Um, but there are, curriculum varies, and one of the interesting things about the data, for example, the outcomes that vouchers. So voucher outcomes on reading metrics, reading scores aren't great, but the really bad results come from math and science scores. Researchers that do use academic outcomes, do use test scores to evaluate schools and school activities, often point to math, especially as kind of a more helpful metric to study what the schools are contributing, just for the simple fact that a lot of kids will read something or at least get some familiarity with reading skills in the home environment or from their friends and family, and maybe less so, especially at older grades of math, meaning you're not necessarily going to learn calculus at the kitchen table or algebra at the kitchen table. You may learn how to read a book at the kitchen table. And so researchers historically have gone to math and science to kind of think about what is the school really doing if we're gonna kind of just look at academic outcomes as measured by test scores. So it's particularly telling that it's on those very subjects that vouchers have face planted when it comes to the metrics here. But the other reason for this is that, listen, I said I'm not here to beat up on any religious faith, and I'm not. But the reality is, and groups, my research team has looked into this, and others have. A lot of these voucher schools, when I say they're subprime, another way to just sort of explain what's being taught there is, for example, many of these schools are teaching creationism. Uh, Go teach creationism if you want to. Send your kid to a school that teaches creationism if you want to. But listen, as far as how a child's going to do on a STEM subject or exam, or training up for a STEM degree, or getting a job in a science related field, learning creationism is not gonna cut it. And that's actually one of the reasons you see that the score is particularly bad in math and science is listen, it's not right-wing voucher lobbyists and sort of critics of me and lots of folks in this space will say it's government over regulation is why the voucher results aren't any good, and they have all these theories for it. The simple reality is they're not teaching anything that kids can use. If you're teaching creationism, your kid's not learning algebra. If you're teaching creationism, your kid's not learning computer science skills. If you're teaching creationism, your kid's not learning how to go out there and necessarily get an MBA. And maybe those are not things that your child wants. Fine, but just we're talking about on the public dime. We're talking about what taxpayers are supporting. These are the trade-offs. And this is why the results are so bad when they're offered. And I guess I would just say, when we do see these polls that are put out there in the field about parents who may want something, they don't call it a voucher in these surveys, but they may want a freedom account, or they may want a scholarship account or something. And they say, leave your struggling public school, your underfunded public school, and come with us to our voucher school. I'd like to know how many of those parents would take that deal. if they knew they were signing up for a world in which they were going to, the results would push their child 15 to 20% below where they were the year before, or they were signing their child up to be substantially below in math or science for years and years. These are not just results that stay for 1 year, but years and years. We're going to push your child behind in STEM subjects. It's not good stuff. If that's what's told to parents, those are parent decisions to make, I suppose. My concern is with the parents who are sold a false story and told that they're going to enter a better environment because the results are overwhelmingly indicating that that's just not true.
Yeah, I appreciate that thinking and just sharing, because I do think we are creating either a society where we're all moving towards equity and equitable practices and being able to participate in society, having a fair chance. And it sounds like actually what we're doing is we're taking away chances from the majority of kids. And again, giving this money to people that already have access, or taking away um, education from kids that are expecting to have more. And it's really criminal. I think the last thing that I just want to ask before we open it up is that public schools, I'm obsessed with public everything. I'm obsessed with public schools specifically. What's the role that public schools play in our democracy? Like, why is this a part of Project 2025?
Oh, so this is a great question, and I'm going to partially answer it now, and then I kind of wrap up with it maybe at the end of this after we take some questions. Because the first way I want to answer this question is just by simply saying, um, strictly in policy terms, like just starting with you know what do we kind of spend public dollars on? Public schools at this point still educate 90% of American children. And if the right wing has its way, that number will go down, but it will still always be something in the majority. Um, the key piece here is that uh, it's certainly true that in practice, public schools haven't worked for everyone all of the time because public schools reflect society and are human institutions. And as human institutions, they're going to reflect human tendencies like racism, like social constructions like income inequality, or again, lack of geographic opportunities. Public schools are going to reflect all those things. But what they also do is they, at least in their best moments, reflect community. They reflect, public schools are not sort of the hard hand of government. They are your friends. They are your neighbors. They may be you if you've ever served on the school board or served as a teacher. They are literally kind of these community educational environments. And the reason that matters to this question of democracy is like that's how we make decisions is in this community. As we vote, we have our voices heard. We put our names down on tickets to decide who we want to represent us at all forms of government. And in a way, that's sort of, listen, even when it comes to choosing who runs our public schools, it's sort of we school boards are elected bodies. Public schools are run by local elected officials, which just means that they're going to reflect the communities that we live in and that we have a stake in. And so I want to put a bookmark on it because I want to return to that at the end of this as we wrap up. But I would just say, like at its core piece, that public schools are responsible for educating the people who are going to be voting, who are going to be representing us in the future, and who are going to be responsible for the country that we live in and the world that we live in moving forward. And that's why this conversation matters so much, and that's why in particular the American right has targeted schools and targeted child-related policy in general, as they understand that at the core this is an argument about what the future looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, it definitely is about having control, unfettered amounts of control over how we spend our money, where our money goes, and how people think about the world, how people experience the world. So, really important. And I know that we're shifting to answer some questions from the chat. Jessica, I don't know if there's like if how we're staggering the questions. I don't know if you can help out. Just with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've got some great questions. If you can see them, Maria, in the chat here. We've got one from David at 12:18 p.m. And maybe we could start with that. You want me to read it out, or do you
Yeah.
have it there? Okay. So it says, Josh, the right wing has been able to pass ESAs in 14 states. Many of these states are blazing red. ALEC and its coalition have stated that they have a goal of getting to 25 states by the end of 2025. How do you see the right wing privateers shifting their messaging in order to pass ESAs in purple states or states with slim red majorities?
Good question. So it is certainly true that all but one, with only one exception since 2020, one have all of the states that have pushed these things through been red states in the sense that they voted for Donald Trump in 2020. And that's part of where this culture war rhetoric comes in, is that it's in those states where Alec, the DeVos folks, the Heritage Foundation, groups like that have shifted the messaging away from academic opportunity and making the choice for Republican legislators who themselves have opposed these voucher schemes for many, many years, making the choice something between MAGA ideology, culture war ideology, and anything else. And when it's framed that way, it's been very difficult for Republican legislators, especially rural Republican legislators who did oppose vouchers in the past, to not support these voucher schemes in the vote. On the margins in those purplish states, listen, the vouchers do in polling. Um, this is where the marketing around opportunity, around hope, around freedom have been used in those environments, particularly in communities of color that have continued to be under-resourced when it comes to public education. And so you do see when these schemes are sold as education freedom or they're sold as hope and opportunity, you do see more support for voucher schemes in public surveys among communities of color. And I think we have to take that seriously. What that's telling us is not that necessarily that communities of color want coupons to go out and fend for themselves in a world where schools can reject their child left and right. That's not what happens when you actually talk about what vouchers do and the false promise behind vouchers. But what that means for someone who cares about what goes on in public schools too, is we need to keep talking about how we can improve public education and the investments that do need to be made in public education. I think that's what that support for these kind of freedomy marketed voucher schemes means in some of these communities. So that's kind of the framing behind this stuff. It's sold. You've heard the phrase "sold a story" that's out there in the education world right now. Vouchers are the ultimate sold a story. It's education's predatory lending, and it's that phraseology around the predatory lending piece, the false promise vouchers that you see especially acute in purple states and in states with large shares of communities of color.
Yeah, everyone wants a great education, and I think people really lean in on that, right? Like that they take advantage of that, of the fact that we've failed, like we've actually, as a society, have failed to provide high quality education across the board, and especially Black, Brown, and poor communities. So there is another question around informing communities. So Guy asks, where can we receive information to communicate and inform our community members? Also, what approach would you recommend that you may have observed, and how do you communicate this information in a very conservative based areas without creating mass conflict in the community?
Well, to the first part of that question, there's a great set of resources just to start at Public Funds Public Schools website. It's, pfps.org, I believe, is the website, and I think there's a bunch of stuff being thrown in the chat there, so you can get some white papers and some basic facts that way. There you go. I see something popping up right now. Certainly, one of the things that I set out to do with the book is to put some, what we know and where it came from into published forms. Folks can use that. Um, the other thing is to it may sound like a strange thing to say, but like the data and the evidence against these schemes are so overwhelming, not just in the research community that I came out of, but almost in real time when you look at what else is going on in the states. And one of the things that I say to reporters and to state legislators, if they, so tag me on social media or something, they say, Josh, what do you think about this? Look at what's going on in the other states. We've got horrific reporting, high quality reporting, but horrific stories coming out of Arizona, coming out of Florida, coming out of Arkansas, coming out of Iowa, about what coming out of Ohio, where the state is literally helping to build private schools to as receptacles for voucher cash. That's actually what's going on, and you can almost look at real time, just the sort of the news cycle. If you're paying attention and we're watching what's happening in other states, don't believe the white papers that are circulated by these right-wing think tanks that have these clever sounding names by people who want to turn this into an intellectual argument and a theoretical promise. We actually see what's going on in real time in the states, and it's not good stuff.
Mm. Yeah, I think I want to add, I really appreciate like look to other states. And I also want to add that one effective thing that happened in Tennessee, and they just recently were able to win against vouchers, was little us, big them. Like, and I think your book really talks about this a lot, is that there is this all of these rich people funding this. Like this is not a grassroots movement at all. And it's really effective to call out, these are the people that are driving this, the Bessie DeVos, the Jeffrey Yasses of the world, and really being able to say, you know, these people can't dictate how we live our lives, how our schools look, and people love their public schools. So that's been really effective as well. I want to jump to Rick's question to Josh. So I hear from voucher supporters that they should be able to take money for education for their child and use it however they want to educate their child. How would you reply to that parent?
Well, there's ample school choice on that public funds already pay for. Wide range of charter schools, wide range of inter-district schools. Certainly, parents who can afford private school tuition already. That's 70% of voucher users. Again, already in private school on their own dime in the first place. Um, uh, can often afford to live in the neighborhoods they want to if they don't want to go to private school. So there's ample school choice already. I think, the way that the families that I want to answer that question for, not the folks clamoring, the overwhelming number of wealthier families already in private school getting these new voucher schemes, but the families that do feel like they are in neighborhoods that have been underinvested in, where public schools have not given them what they want for their kids. I do think we need to take that question seriously for those communities. And I think I would just say, at the end of the day, unfortunately, it's just the simple fact that vouchers aren't going to work. The other side sells this not just as academic opportunity and hope. What they don't tell you, and it gets back to this idea the schools do the picking, just because you are eligible for a voucher, just because you even have a voucher in hand or on your phone app, as is often the case these days, just because you have that in hand, you need a place to spend it. And that isn't your decision. That is the school's decision about whether they're going to take you or your child. And so I cannot stress enough the false promise behind these things. Vouchers are only as good as the school that's willing to admit your child. And that's a sad and uncomfortable thing to say. I see often these right-wing groups, the Cato Institute, which is founded by Charles Koch, out there. They make these arguments today about values, and they'll say, parents should just be able to send their child to the school whose values fit with theirs. But I would just sort of say, implied in the argument about values is the devaluing of children too, and in particular of other people's children. And so one thing that I think people have to remember is that if you're hearing anything, any scheme from these right-wing groups that says that we're giving vouchers to everyone and everyone is just going to get to choose, remember someone's on the losing end of that choice. Someone, are you willing to roll the dice and to put your child on the receiving end of another person's value system? And judgment about who's worth what and where different kids should be able to go to school, because that's what vouchers bake into this system, unfortunately. And so the only alternative is to invest in the communities we have, is to invest in public schools we have, is to invest in neighborhoods we have, and try to kind of build everybody up rather than kind of giving everybody a coupon, leaving them to fend for themselves. I think that's not only just what the data say, it's also the right thing to do.
I love how consistent you are. It's like I'm smiling over here because I keep hearing this in the back of my head because it doesn't work. It's a scheme. It's a
Yeah.
scam. Um, I have one more question here, Josh. Why don't states regulate the private schools that receive public dollars the way that they regulate public schools?
Well, they used to. When I first got into this work 20 years ago, they used to. In fact, much of what we know about the horrific evident outcomes for kids in these voucher schools comes from the fact that, for at least to some extent, states did have meaningful oversight of voucher schools, did require voucher schools to take the same exam as public schools, did require voucher schools to open their books financially. So we could be sure that parents weren't just getting, embezzled essentially on with public dollars. We're not getting the kid admitted and then basically getting skimped on. So schools could either make a profit or divert the revenue into a church. You did have to do some of these things up until around 2021, 2022, when the new flavor of these voucher schemes came to be. Now anything goes. I've done some writing in multiple spaces about what I think these voucher schemes need to have in terms of oversight to even have a chance at helping kids and families. I'm not going to get into all those details there, but I am going to share one thing with you, and that's, when folks have tried. So I'll give an example. Governor Hobbs, Democrat in Arizona, had a budget bill in January, which included a 6-point plan to oversee and rein in a little bit some of the public spending on voucher school schemes in that state. And some of the components of that plan, like when I first started getting there, it would have been like, I can't even believe you're having these arguments. So, for example, all teachers at voucher-funded private schools had to have a background check, had to submit to the same background check that public school teachers. That was a non-starter for the Republican supermajority in that legislature, or the conservative right-wing Goldwater Institute. There, they said that's overregulation. If
Mm.
we're in a place where simply background checking the adults that are serving kids in these voucher scheme schools is too much oversight, then I'm not optimistic in the short term that we're going to get to a place where we can kind of say, we also need to make sure you're not defrauding taxpayers, and we also have to make sure you're not selling parents a story on the academic hope or the academic opportunity you're giving them. So finances and academic outcomes would be the things I'd first point to, but even just some basic stuff like safety, it seemed to be a step too far for some of these organizations that are pushing these schemes. Unfortunately, it's very sad because it wasn't always true.
Yeah, and I think it marks, you said that started in 2021. And I think it's important to mark that as well. I think there is a bunch of things that have been deregulated, and it's really important to lift that
For
up.
sure.
We have one more question from Angie, and we have about 6 minutes. What steps can we take to fight back? Parents, generalizations don't seem to understand the gravity of the situation, given that they hear legislators talk so much about parent choice. I live in Texas, and vouchers will be a hot topic in the next year's legislative session.
Yeah, well, Texas has held the line until recently. So the second biggest state in the union, still actual parents, actual voters. Voters, by the way, it's vouchers have never won a statewide ballot initiative, not once. So when it comes to actual, that's how I'd answer this question. What do you do when you put these questions and these schemes to actual voters, actual parents? Turns out they don't like them. At least they haven't so far. They've always rejected these things. That's why it takes so much money and so much effort and so much marketing and so much spin from these right-wing organizations just to cobble together enough votes, even among Republican legislators, to get these things true. And they haven't been able to do it in Texas. If vouchers were a grassroots movement, Texas would have been there a long time ago. Not known as a far liberal state, but vouchers have not been not passed there.
Mm.
But I would start with that. I would start with that. Just listen. I mean, these things have become enormously unpopular, and the awful story about these things are told, and that's what we need to keep doing.
Yeah, I think, and I'll just add, in terms of the Texas work, it's been pretty amazing because the state union there has been doing a lot of work, a lot of organizing, a lot of fighting back. And then there's also another organization, Pastors for Texas Children, which has done a phenomenal job really lifting up as pastors why they're against vouchers, right? Like that this goes against their fundamental beliefs that everyone should have access to high quality education and how this harms kids. So I think I just want to come back to like organizing. Like it's a reason why I really leaned in. Building that community power, having these conversations and demystifying this is really important. And then moving people into action. And Jessica, I saw here, I'm just going to, because I know that you wanted to come back, Josh, to this idea of like the role that this all plays in our democracy. But there's a sweet comment in the chat that I haven't found. I don't know if you want to share it, Jessica.
Sure. I want to end with a very kind message that one of our audience members sent about the book. But Josh, do you want to say some closing words on that concept, and then we can close out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess, I guess I would summarize a lot of what I've said here today is that these, I started this work just looking at data, just looking at evidence, and having what now seems to me something of an amoral view on this stuff. It just kind of, well, let's follow the evidence wherever it leads, and let's follow the data. And I think that's very useful and can be really helpful, particularly in controversial areas. But what I've learned on this particular topic is that the data and the evidence sort of led woefully away from vouchers as a solution to anything resembling to anything associated with poverty, with lack of opportunity, or with longstanding persistent problems around race, around income, around history. And so, I think what I would close with here is just simply saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And what I mean by that is most of the work worth doing in a democracy, whether it's when it comes to how we think about this upcoming election, when it comes to how we think about issues of individual rights, when it comes to how we think about the responsibilities we all have, not just as citizens, but in our own private roles as parents, as adult children, as educators, as as folks who build things for a living, who sell things for a living. All of these things are about how we work together in a very, very diverse country, and in a country that's becoming even more so over time. And I don't have all of the solutions, whether it comes to public schools or the rest of public policy, but what I do know is that vouchers fail catastrophically, not just on the data, not just on the evidence, but on the commitments that sort of we all have to the future, because they avoid those hard questions. They avoid that hard work, and they ask us to just simply further isolate, further separate ourselves in a way that doesn't reflect the world that we live in today. And I'm really, really hoping that over the next few years, we have more opportunity to push these things back, and I think we will.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you both for this fantastic conversation. So as we said, we wanted to end with something that one of our audience members, Rick Johnson, put in the chat. He said, "The Privateers is one of the most powerful books I have ever read that exposes the so-called school choice that vouchers allegedly offer to parents and students. It is a must-read for all who believe in the ideas of public education." So thank you, Rick, and we agree. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the advocacy page of the PFPS website. It will also be emailed out to all of you audience members. If you're not on our general email list, you can sign up at pfps.org/contacts. Thank you to ELC's Caitlin Comasanias, Nicole Chulo, Wendy Lecker, and Sharon Krangle for all the work behind the scenes to make this possible. Thank you to Maria Bautista from NYU Metro Center for leading this great discussion. And of course, thank you to ELC's Senior Fellow Josh Cowen. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. It is always wonderful to have you all here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye, y'all. Thanks.